The most unsettling moments in human history rarely begin with explosions or alarms. They begin quietly, with patterns that do not quite fit, with measurements that behave correctly on paper, yet feel wrong when placed side by side. In the early 21st century, seismologists noticed something subtle. Not a single catastrophic earthquake, not a dramatic rupture line tearing across continents, but a growing irregularity in how tremors were clustering, migrating, and repeating across regions that had never been strongly linked before. Individually, each event made sense. Collectively, they formed something harder to explain. At the same time, in archives far removed from modern monitoring stations, scholars were still translating ancient texts that described the Earth not as a stable foundation, but as a living system capable of abrupt, violent reorganization. Civilizations separated by oceans and millennia described moments when the ground itself seemed to turn, tilt, or reset. Most historians treat these passages as metaphor. Most scientists treat modern seismic anomalies as coincidence within complex systems. But the question that quietly refuses to disappear is this: what if these two domains, ancient warning and modern measurement, are not as disconnected as we assume? Before continuing, take a moment. If you're listening from a bed, a night shift, a quiet train, or somewhere far from home, you are welcome to share where you are. Not to interrupt the story, only to remind ourselves that this question belongs to all of us, wherever we are, when the ground feels steady beneath our feet. Now let us move carefully. The system often referred to as 3-Eye Atlas is not, in itself, mysterious. At its core, it represents an integration of seismic monitoring networks, satellite geodesy, interferometric radar, and AI-assisted pattern recognition. Tools like these are widely used in earth sciences today. They exist to answer practical questions: where stress is accumulating, how tectonic plates transfer energy, which regions may be approaching failure thresholds. There is nothing prophetic about this, and yet what unsettled some researchers was not what the system detected, but how often it detected similar behaviors in historically unrelated zones. Micro-tremor chains appearing thousands of kilometers apart within narrow windows of time. Subtle changes in crustal uplift mirrored across different plates. Stress redistribution patterns that appeared to migrate rather than dissipate. None of this implies an impending catastrophe. Earth systems are complex, nonlinear, and often counterintuitive. But complexity becomes troubling when it begins to echo something older. Ancient cultures did not have seismographs. They did not understand plate tectonics, but they were keen observers of land, sky, and time. And in several traditions, Sumerian, Mesoamerican, Indus, and even early Mediterranean, there are recurring descriptions of a great shift that was not localized, but planetary in scale. These accounts do not describe a single earthquake. They describe a sequence. First, unrest, then confusion of seasons, then instability of ground and water. Finally, a restructuring of human settlement itself. Scholars debate how literal these texts should be read. Many argue they encode social collapse, not geological events. Others suggest they reflect memory of post-glacial climate disruption. What matters is not certainty, but alignment. Because when researchers plotted certain long-term seismic stress trends alongside paleoclimate records, they noticed something uncomfortable. Periods of rapid environmental transition often coincided with increased tectonic volatility. This does not mean climate causes earthquakes in a simple way, but it does suggest that Earth systems, atmospheric, hydrological, and tectonic, do not operate in isolation. The planet is not a machine with independent parts. It is a coupled system. Ancient writers did not say the Earth broke. They said it shifted. That word appears again and again. Not destruction, reorientation. In Sumerian texts, translated cautiously, there are references to the land losing its place and the foundations forgetting their order. These phrases are often dismissed as poetic, but poetry is how pre-scientific cultures encoded observation. They had no equations. They had language. Modern seismology, by contrast, has equations but often lacks narrative. Data is segmented, categorized, isolated. 3i Atlas did not create new data. It simply allowed patterns to emerge that had previously been hidden by scale. And when those patterns emerged, they didn't resemble the random noise expected from independent fault systems. They resembled coordination. This is where caution is essential. Coordination does not mean intention. It does not mean design. It does not mean prophecy. But it does challenge a comfortable assumption that Earth's deep systems change only slowly and independently. Geological history disagrees. The Younger Dryas boundary, roughly 12,900 years ago, remains one of the most abrupt climate transitions known. Ice cores show rapid temperature swings. Sediment layers show sudden flooding. Megafaunal extinction accelerates. Some researchers propose cometary impact. Others propose ocean circulation collapse. None claim certainty. What is clear is that Earth can reorganize faster than human institutions can respond. Ancient societies may not have known why this happened, but they knew that it did, and they remembered. The question is not whether ancient texts predicted modern seismic models. That would be a misunderstanding. The deeper question is this: did ancient civilizations recognize patterns of instability that modern society has forgotten because we outsourced observation to instruments? 3i Atlas does not read clay tablets, it reads numbers. But numbers, when arranged over long time frames, can begin to tell stories eerily similar to those once told around firelight. Stories of warning signs ignored, of subtle precursors dismissed, of change arriving not as a singular event, but as a cascade. There is no official declaration that the planet is entering such a phase. There is no consensus that modern seismic trends indicate a global shift. But there is growing agreement that Earth's systems are more tightly coupled than previously believed. And coupling means vulnerability to synchronization. This is where the narrative becomes uncomfortable. Because if changes are distributed rather than localized, they are harder to mitigate, harder to predict, and harder to communicate without causing fear. Governments do not suppress data to hide truth. They suppress it to manage uncertainty. Panic is a real risk. Economic destabilization is a real risk. Misinterpretation spreads faster than understanding. Ancient cultures handled this differently. They encoded warnings into myth, ritual, and story. Slow information transfer mechanisms that allowed societies to adapt culturally before catastrophe arrived physically. Modern society relies on immediacy, breaking news, instant reaction, which raises a final question for this segment. If a global terrestrial shift were approaching, not tomorrow, not next year, but within historical time, would modern civilization even recognize it as such? Or would it appear only as disconnected anomalies until the pattern became undeniable? That question remains open. Ancient civilizations did not preserve warnings casually. Stone carving, clay tablet inscription, and oral transmission across generations required enormous effort. Nothing was recorded unless it mattered. This is the first assumption that modern readers often overlook. When Sumerian scribes pressed symbols into wet clay, they were not journaling. They were encoding law, ritual, lineage, and survival knowledge. Clay was chosen precisely because it endured fire, flood, and collapse. So when repeated references appear to instability of land, sky, and time itself, scholars are forced to ask not what did they believe, but why did they insist on remembering it? The Sumerian tablets often grouped environmental disturbance alongside political collapse and divine withdrawal. This is usually interpreted as theology, gods punishing kings, chaos following moral failure. But this interpretation assumes metaphor first and observation second. There is another possibility, debated cautiously among historians of science, that theology was the language, not the cause. In other words, ancient cultures may have lacked geological vocabulary, but not geological memory. The earth did not need to be understood to be feared. Many tablets describe cycles, not linear history. Time is framed as recurring ages, separated by disruption, before kingship, after kingship, before order, after the Great Turning. Importantly, these disruptions are not described as singular disasters. They unfold. First, signs in the heavens, then unrest among waters, then shifting ground. Finally, human displacement. Modern readers are tempted to interpret this as mythic storytelling, but archaeologists have found that periods described as ends in these traditions often align with real layers of abandonment, sediment flooding, or sudden architectural change. No one claims perfect correlation, but the overlap is persistent enough to demand attention. Why, then, encode this knowledge as prophecy rather than record? Because prophecy does not expire. A historical record ends when it is no longer relevant. A prophecy remains active until fulfilled. This distinction matters. If ancient cultures experienced abrupt environmental destabilization, events rare on human timescales, they would have understood that warning future generations mattered more than documenting the past. This reframes prophecy not as prediction, but as memory extended forward. Now consider modern seismic systems. 3I Atlas, like other advanced integrative monitoring platforms, is designed to recognize patterns humans cannot. It does not predict earthquakes. It identifies stress migration, correlation clusters, and non-random repetition. In isolation, these metrics are technical, but when aggregated, they begin to resemble something ancient observers described qualitatively, not collapse, not destruction, but preparatory instability. This is where the discomfort deepens. Ancient texts rarely describe the shift itself in detail. They describe the approach. They emphasize recognition, not survival. Why? Because recognition allows adaptation. A society that understands instability is coming can decentralize, diversify, and prepare psychologically. A society that assumes permanence collapses faster. Modern civilization is optimized for stability. Supply chains assume predictability. Cities assume fixed coastlines. Infrastructure assumes long-term equilibrium. Ancient societies assumed none of this. They built with the expectation of abandonment. They ritualized renewal. They encoded warnings not as alarms, but as stories retold slowly, which brings us to an uncomfortable modern parallel. Scientific institutions are conservative by necessity. They require overwhelming evidence before revising foundational assumptions. This is a strength, but also a delay mechanism. No seismologist today would claim the planet is approaching a coordinated shift. There is insufficient evidence. But there is growing evidence that tectonic, climatic, and hydrological systems influence one another more strongly than previously believed. And there is growing evidence that Earth's history includes abrupt transitions that were not locally contained. Ancient civilizations may have lacked measurement, but they had time depth. They lived closer to past disruptions. We live further away from them. This distance creates confidence. Confidence creates blind spots. Some researchers have begun revisiting ancient environmental narratives not as superstition, but as proto-systems theory. Early attempts to describe complex feedback loops using story rather than mathematics. For example, flood myths are often dismissed as exaggerations of river overflow, but global flood narratives appear in regions with no shared hydrology. This does not imply a single global flood event. It implies shared experience of rapid water redistribution. Melting ice sheets, rising sea levels, coastal inundation. These processes are now well documented scientifically. Ancient myths may reflect lived experience of these changes. Similarly, stories of the sky changing are often interpreted as metaphor. But ice core data shows periods of rapid atmospheric composition change. Following volcanic or extraterrestrial events, again, no certainty. But convergence. Three Eyes Atlas does not validate prophecy. It validates complexity. And complexity is what ancient traditions described using gods, omens, and cycles. This leads to a crucial modern misunderstanding. People assume ancient warnings were meant to predict specific dates. They were not. They were meant to teach recognition of patterns. Pattern recognition is precisely what modern AI-driven Earth systems now excel at. This is where the parallel becomes unsettling. Because the same pattern recognition task, performed with story in the past and algorithms in the present, is producing similar unease. Not panic. Unease, subtle anomalies, unexpected alignments, stress appearing where models did not anticipate it. None of this implies inevitability, but it does imply humility. The Earth has changed before, in ways humans did not expect. It will change again. The only question is whether we recognize the approach or explain it away until adaptation is no longer possible. Ancient cultures left us reminders not because they believed themselves special, but because they knew they were temporary. That perspective is rare today, and perhaps that is the most dangerous difference of all. In the next segment, we will examine why modern institutions struggle to communicate uncertainty and how ancient societies handled fear without collapsing into paralysis. Because understanding how information is transmitted may matter as much as the information itself. Modern societies are deeply uncomfortable with uncertainty. This is not a flaw of intelligence. It is a consequence of scale. When civilizations were small, uncertainty could be absorbed locally. A failed harvest meant migration, adaptation, or collapse of a single city. Today, uncertainty propagates globally. This changes how information is handled. Scientific institutions are designed to prevent panic, not provoke reflection. They communicate in probabilities, confidence intervals, and peer review cycles. These are essential safeguards, but they also slow narrative response. Ancient societies operated differently. They did not wait for certainty. They waited for patterns. This difference explains why ancient records often feel prophetic, while modern warnings feel muted. In ancient Mesopotamia, uncertainty was ritualized. Omens were cataloged not because they predicted outcomes, but because they mapped relationships. If the river behaves this way, expect that. If the sky changes color, prepare for unrest. If earthquakes follow drought, move stores inland. None of this required knowing causes. It required noticing sequences. Modern science, by contrast, demands causal explanation before public emphasis. This creates a paradox. We can detect anomalies earlier than ever, yet hesitate longer before acting on them. 3i Atlas exists within this paradox. Its purpose is not to declare catastrophe. It is to flag correlation. Correlation does not imply causation, but it does imply structure. Ancient systems also worked with structure, not causation. This is where education becomes critical. Many misunderstand seismic monitoring as prediction. It is not. Modern systems track stress accumulation, fault interactions, and temporal clustering. They do not say what will happen. They say where the system is changing. This distinction matters. The Earth is not a machine with discrete failures. It is a coupled system. Changes in one domain affect others. Tectonics influence ocean circulation. Ocean circulation affects climate. Climate alters surface load. Surface load feeds back into tectonic stress. These relationships are now well established in geophysics. Ancient civilizations did not know the mechanics, but they experienced the outcomes. Their warnings were not about single disasters. They were about transitions. This explains why ancient narratives rarely end with destruction. They end with dispersal. People move. Languages fracture. Cities are abandoned. New orders emerge. Collapse in these texts is not annihilation. It is reconfiguration. This is another modern misunderstanding. When we hear collapse, we imagine sudden extinction. Ancient cultures understood collapse as loss of central coherence. This is precisely what systems theory predicts under stress. Centralized systems fail first. Distributed systems adapt longer. Ancient societies were forced into decentralization repeatedly. Their stories reflect this hard-earned lesson. Now consider how modern information is centralized. A handful of institutions define acceptable narratives. This is efficient, but brittle. When anomalies arise that do not fit existing frameworks, they are often siloed. Geology studies them separately from climatology. Climatology separates them from archaeology. Archaeology avoids speculation about planetary processes. This specialization is necessary, but it fragments understanding. Ancient societies did the opposite. They integrated knowledge into unified cosmologies. This made them less precise, but more holistic. It is tempting to dismiss this as superstition, but from a systems perspective, it allowed pattern recognition across domains. This is why ancient warnings feel broad rather than specific. They were designed to remain relevant regardless of mechanism. Watch the waters. Listen to the ground. Observe the sky. These are not predictions. They are instructions. 3I, Atlas in a sense, is a modern version of this instruction, translated into mathematics. It does not say the shift is coming. It says the system is behaving differently. This distinction is often lost in popular interpretation. Fear arises when people expect certainty and receive ambiguity. Ancient cultures expected ambiguity. Their narratives prepared people emotionally, not just practically. Rituals served as psychological adaptation. Myths provided cognitive framing. Communal storytelling reduced isolation. Modern societies lack equivalent mechanisms. We rely on reassurance instead of preparation. This is not inherently wrong, but it carries risk. When reassurance fails suddenly, trust collapses. Ancient systems maintained trust by acknowledging uncertainty openly. They did not promise stability. They promised continuity through change. This may explain why their warnings were preserved for millennia. They were not alarmist. They were instructional. Now, we return to the question of secrecy. Are warnings being hidden? The more accurate answer is less dramatic and more troubling. Warnings are diluted. Information is fragmented into technical silos. Public communication avoids narrative coherence to prevent misinterpretation. As a result, no single message feels urgent until it is unavoidable. Ancient societies did the opposite. They concentrated meaning. A single story could carry environmental, moral, and social guidance simultaneously. Modern communication separates these domains and loses resonance. This is not conspiracy, it is structure, and structure determines outcomes. As scientific models improve, they reveal increasing complexity, not clarity. The Earth appears less predictable, not more. This mirrors ancient understanding. Stability was never assumed, only cycles. The unsettling implication is this: ancient warnings were not about preventing change. They were about surviving it, with coherence intact. Modern society is excellent at prevention. It is poor at acceptance. 3i. Atlas does not force a conclusion. It invites a posture. Observation, humility, preparation without panic. The danger is not that ancient prophecies were correct. The danger is that we may be repeating the same mistake, assuming permanence where none exists. In the next segment, we will examine why humans psychologically resist gradual warnings, and how civilizations historically failed not at the moment of disaster, but during the long period of denial before it. Because collapse rarely begins with an earthquake. It begins with dismissal. Human beings are remarkably skilled at surviving sudden danger. What we struggle with is slow change. This is not a moral failure. It is a neurological one. The human brain evolved to respond to immediate threats, predators, storms, conflict. Gradual shifts rarely triggered the same urgency. By the time a slow danger became obvious, adaptation was already required. Ancient societies understood this intuitively. They did not rely on urgency alone. They embedded warnings into culture. This is why environmental instability was often tied to ritual calendars, seasonal myths, and moral stories. These narratives were repeated regularly, not when danger was imminent, but continuously. Repetition kept awareness alive without panic. Modern civilization, however, is structured around optimization. Efficiency depends on predictability. Predictability depends on stable assumptions. Gradual warnings challenge those assumptions and are therefore resisted. This resistance is subtle. It does not appear as denial at first. It appears as delay. Data is reviewed again. Models are refined. Thresholds are raised. Each step is reasonable in isolation. Together, they create inertia. Ancient societies did not have this luxury. A river that changed course meant famine. A drought that lasted too long meant migration. They could not wait for certainty. Instead, they watched for convergence. When multiple signs aligned, unusual skies, restless waters, shifting ground, response followed. This convergence-based approach is now returning to modern science through interdisciplinary research. Geophysicists study tectonic stress. Climatologists track atmospheric circulation. Oceanographers analyze current disruption. Individually, each field produces cautious conclusions. But when findings are layered, patterns emerge. Not predictions, but trajectories. 3i Atlas operates in this layered space. It does not focus on single events. It tracks relationships between events. This mirrors ancient methods more closely than modern ones might admit. Ancient observers did not isolate earthquakes from floods. They saw them as connected expressions of imbalance. Modern systems are rediscovering this. For example, glacial melt reduces surface load on continental crust. This alters stress distribution along faults. Faults respond over decades, not days. This relationship is now well documented. Ancient flood myths may reflect lived experience of similar transitions without knowledge of mechanics. Again, this does not validate prophecy. It validates memory. The danger arises when memory is dismissed because it lacks explanation. Ancient societies did not require explanation to act. Modern societies often do. This creates a psychological gap. When early signs appear, they are labeled anomalies. Anomalies require context. Context takes time. By the time context is established, systems may already be destabilized. This pattern appears repeatedly in historical collapse. Not sudden catastrophe, but delayed recognition. The Bronze Age collapse, for instance, was not caused by a single event. It was a cascade: climate stress, trade disruption, migration, political fragmentation. Each factor alone was survivable. Together, they overwhelmed centralized systems. Ancient texts describing ages ending may reflect such cascades rather than singular disasters. This reframes the idea of a terrestrial shift. Not a dramatic rupture, but a redistribution of stability. Modern civilization is highly centralized. Energy grids, food systems, financial networks, all assume continuity. Ancient societies learned painfully that continuity is temporary. Their stories remind us not that disaster is inevitable, but that rigidity is fatal. Now consider how fear operates. Fear demands immediacy, but gradual change does not feel immediate. So fear is postponed. Ancient societies solved this by ritualizing anticipation. Festivals marking renewal, mourning, and transition kept the idea of change present without terror. Modern culture lacks equivalent rituals for systemic uncertainty. We oscillate between complacency and panic. This oscillation erodes trust. When institutions reassure too strongly, credibility suffers when conditions worsen. When warnings are overstated, people disengage. Ancient narratives avoided both extremes. They spoke calmly of inevitability, not as doom, but as cycle. This is a lesson worth revisiting. The unsettling implication is not that ancient prophecies were accurate. It is that they were psychologically adaptive. They trained people to live with uncertainty. Modern society, despite technological sophistication, struggles with this. 3i Atlas does not demand belief. It demands attention. It asks us to notice patterns without insisting on conclusions. This posture aligns more closely with ancient wisdom than modern expectation. We want answers. Ancient societies wanted readiness. There is a difference. And readiness does not require fear. It requires humility. In the next segment, we will explore how ancient cultures preserved knowledge through collapse and why warnings survived even when cities did not. Because what lasts is rarely what is strongest. It is what is remembered. When cities fall, knowledge usually falls with them. Archives burn, libraries collapse, specialists disappear. Yet some forms of knowledge survive repeatedly, even after profound social breakdown. This survival is not accidental. Ancient societies learned, through experience, that centralized knowledge is fragile. So they developed parallel methods of preservation. The most important knowledge was not stored only in buildings. It was embedded in practices, stories, and symbols. This is why warnings appear in myth rather than manuals. A manual requires literacy, stability, and institutional continuity. A story requires only memory and repetition. The Sumerians understood this distinction. Their most enduring narratives were not administrative texts, but cosmological ones. Creation stories, flood accounts, cycles of destruction and renewal. These stories were recited long after cities crumbled. Archaeologists know this because versions of the same narratives appear centuries apart, written by different cultures, in different regions, with altered names but preserved structure. This persistence suggests intentional design, not deception, not superstition, but resilience. When a society collapses, what survives is what can be carried. Stone is heavy, clay tablets break, but stories move with people. This matters when considering warnings about environmental instability. Ancient civilizations could not assume continuity of institutions, so they encoded essential information in the most portable medium available: narrative. Narrative does not preserve data. It preserves relationships. For example, flood stories rarely specify water levels or timelines. They specify sequences: warning, disbelief, loss, survival, renewal. These sequences are transferable across contexts. Modern societies often misunderstand this. We search ancient texts for numbers, dates, and technical detail. When we do not find them, we dismiss the content as symbolic. But symbolism was the solution. Symbols compress complexity into memory-friendly form. This compression is why ancient warnings appear vague, but remain applicable. Now consider how this intersects with modern monitoring systems. 3i Atlas generates vast quantities of data. Most of it will never be read by humans directly. The system relies on pattern recognition rather than narrative. This is powerful, but ephemeral. If the system fails, the data becomes inaccessible. If the institution dissolves, interpretation ends. Ancient societies anticipated this. Fragility. They assumed collapse was inevitable at some scale. So they designed warnings to outlast infrastructure. This is not romanticism. It is pragmatism. History supports this interpretation. After the fall of Sumerian city-states, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian cultures preserved and adapted earlier narratives. The names of gods changed. The core patterns did not. The flood remained. The warning remained. The lesson remained. This continuity suggests that what mattered was not the literal event, but the pattern of response. Modern society tends to ask, will this happen again? Ancient societies asked, what do we do when it happens? This difference in framing is crucial. One seeks certainty, the other seeks adaptability. When modern readers encounter references to the sky changing or the ground trembling, they often look for astronomical explanations or singular catastrophes. But ancient texts rarely frame these events as isolated. They frame them as thresholds, before and after. This suggests that the warning was not about the event itself, but about the transition it marked. Transitions destabilize identity. Who governs? Who owns land? Who remembers law? These questions mattered more than physical destruction. Ancient warnings therefore focus on social consequences as much as environmental ones. This aligns with modern systems theory. Complex systems do not fail evenly. They fail asymmetrically. Infrastructure collapses faster than culture. Culture collapses faster than memory. What remains shapes the next order. This is why ancient texts emphasize preservation of values rather than prevention of change. They assume change will occur. They focus on continuity of meaning. This perspective reframes the fear surrounding modern monitoring. 3i Atlas does not herald doom. It highlights transition zones. The danger lies not in the shift, but in the rigidity of response. Ancient societies that adapted survived. Those that clung to centralized control collapsed. This is visible in archaeological layers. Sites showing gradual abandonment often preserve cultural continuity. Sites destroyed suddenly often vanish from history. The difference is preparation. Ancient warnings were preparation mechanisms, not alarms, but training. Training people to expect instability. Training leaders to decentralize authority. Training communities to remember what matters. Modern societies rarely train for uncertainty. We ensure against loss, but do not rehearse transformation. This creates vulnerability. When early signs appear, whether seismic, climatic, or social, they are treated as anomalies rather than rehearsals. Ancient societies treated anomalies as reminders. This difference explains why ancient narratives feel repetitive. Repetition was intentional. It kept the lesson active across generations. Modern audiences often find this repetition boring, but boredom is a luxury of stability. Repetition is how memory survives collapse. The unsettling implication is this: our most advanced systems may detect change earlier than ever, but our cultural frameworks may be less capable of responding meaningfully. We have replaced shared narrative with specialized expertise. This improves precision, but weakens collective understanding. 3i Atlas speaks in data. Ancient warnings spoke in story. Both are incomplete alone. The challenge is integration, not believing ancient prophecy, not fearing modern data, but recognizing that how we respond to uncertainty determines outcome more than uncertainty itself. In the next segment, we will examine how modern power structures respond to destabilizing information and why control, not ignorance, has historically been the dominant response. Because the most dangerous moment in any transition is not the first tremor. It is the attempt to preserve the old order at all costs. Power structures rarely collapse suddenly. They resist. History shows this again and again. When destabilizing information emerges, whether environmental, social, or economic, the first response of centralized authority is not adaptation, but containment. This response is not necessarily malicious. It is structural. Centralized systems depend on predictability. Their legitimacy rests on the promise of continuity. Information that suggests instability threatens not only public confidence, but the authority itself. Ancient societies understood this tension. Many early texts describe rulers who ignored warnings, not because they were ignorant, but because acknowledgement would undermine their control. This theme appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian literature. Kings are warned, signs are interpreted, but action is delayed. Not due to disbelief, but due to consequence. To admit that land may shift, that rivers may rise, or that cycles are ending, is to admit that power is temporary. Few rulers do this willingly. Modern institutions face the same dilemma. Scientific bodies are not political by design, but their findings exist within political systems. When data suggests increased volatility, it raises questions that no single institution can answer. Who prepares? Who pays? Who decides what is enough evidence? The safest response becomes moderation. Statements are carefully worded. Uncertainty is emphasized. Conclusions are postponed. Again, this is not conspiracy. It is caution. But caution has a cost. Ancient societies encoded warnings in myth, partly to bypass authority. Stories could circulate even when official acknowledgement was absent. A priest might hesitate to confront a king, but a story told to children could persist for generations. This decentralization of warning was effective. Modern societies lack equivalent informal channels. Information flows upward to institutions, then downward to the public. If it stalls at the top, awareness dissipates. This creates a dangerous asymmetry. Data exists, patterns are observed, but collective readiness remains low. 3i Atlas operates within this tension. It provides signals, not narratives. Signals require interpretation. Interpretation requires authority. Authority prefers stability. Ancient societies resolved this by embedding interpretation into culture itself. The message did not belong to a ruler or institution. It belonged to everyone. This difference shapes outcomes. When ancient cities collapsed, survivors carried stories, not commands. Those stories informed settlement choices, social organization, and ritual practice. Modern societies, by contrast, rely on centralized instruction. When instruction falters, confusion spreads. This is why trust becomes critical. Ancient cultures maintained trust by acknowledging uncertainty openly. They did not promise safety. They promised continuity of meaning. Modern institutions often promise control. This promise is harder to sustain. When anomalies persist, without explanation, confidence erodes. People turn to speculation, not because they reject science, but because silence invites narrative. Ancient warnings filled this narrative space. Modern silence leaves it open. This is where misunderstanding arises. When people sense patterns but receive no framing, fear emerges. Fear is not the result of information, but of unframed information. Ancient myths framed fear as cycle, not catastrophe. They did not deny suffering, but contextualized it. This reduced panic. Modern discourse often oscillates between reassurance and alarm, with little middle ground. This oscillation destabilizes trust. A more ancient approach would accept uncertainty without dramatization. 3i Atlas, in its technical neutrality, actually aligns with this approach. It neither reassures nor alarms. It reports. The challenge is translation. How does a society translate neutral signals into meaningful preparedness without inducing panic? Ancient societies answered this through ritual. Ritual slowed response. It created space for reflection. Modern societies respond rapidly but shallowly. Speed replaces depth. This is efficient but fragile. When complex systems destabilize, shallow responses fail. Ancient cultures slowed time during crisis. Festivals paused labor. Rituals reorganized hierarchy. Communal storytelling reinforced cohesion. These practices were not symbolic distractions. They were adaptive technologies. Modern societies lack equivalent mechanisms. We rely on information flow rather than social cohesion. This works until information overwhelms. At that point, fragmentation occurs. This fragmentation is visible historically. Civilizations rarely collapse because of the environment alone. They collapse when social response fractures. Ancient warnings focused on this fracture. They described not only floods or quakes, but division, arrogance, and forgetfulness. These moral dimensions are often dismissed by modern readers, but they may reflect social dynamics rather than ethics. Division weakens collective response. Arrogance delays adaptation. Forgetfulness repeats mistakes. Seen this way, ancient warnings are less mystical than practical. They describe failure modes. Modern systems have different failure modes, but similar vulnerabilities. Centralization increases efficiency, but reduces resilience. Specialization increases knowledge, but fragments understanding. Speed increases responsiveness, but reduces reflection. 3i Atlas highlights system behavior. Ancient warnings highlighted system consequences. Together, they suggest a pattern. The most dangerous moment is not the shift itself, but the refusal to decentralize response. History shows that civilizations that adapted socially survived environmental stress. Those that clung to centralized control collapsed. This is not ideology, it is observation. In the next segment, we will explore how decentralization appears in archaeological evidence and why periods following collapse often produce innovation rather than decline. Because endings in history are rarely final. They are transitions, and transitions reward those prepared to change. Archaeology tells a quieter story than catastrophe narratives suggest. When we look closely at layers following periods of disruption, we do not always see darkness. We often see reorganization. Cities vanish, but villages appear. Trade routes collapse, but local exchange intensifies. Written records diminish, but craft traditions evolve. This pattern has puzzled historians for decades. Why does collapse so often coincide with innovation? The answer lies in decentralization. When centralized systems fail, constraints loosen. People adapt not by rebuilding what was lost, but by creating what fits the new conditions. Ancient societies understood this intuitively. Their warnings did not promise preservation of empires. They emphasized continuity of life. This distinction matters. Empires prioritize scale. Life prioritizes adaptability. After major environmental stress, archaeological evidence frequently shows a shift towards smaller, more flexible settlements. These settlements are less impressive architecturally, but more resilient. They require fewer resources. They rely on local knowledge. They adapt quickly. This is not regression. It is recalibration. Ancient narratives often describe this phase as a return to simplicity. Modern readers interpret this as decline. But simplicity is not failure. It is response. Now consider how this applies to the idea of a terrestrial shift. Ancient texts do not describe humanity ending. They describe humanity redistributing. The emphasis is on movement, not extinction. This aligns with what we know scientifically. Large-scale environmental change rarely eliminates all life. It reshapes habitability. Coastlines shift. River systems alter. Agricultural zones migrate. Those who move adapt. Those who remain rigid suffer. This perspective reframes fear. The threat is not annihilation. It is misalignment. Ancient warnings focused on misalignment. They warned against building permanence where change was inevitable. Modern civilization does the opposite. We pour concrete into coastlines. We centralize food production. We assume stability as baseline. This makes us efficient, but brittle. Archaeological records show that societies which assumed permanence collapsed harder than those that expected impermanence. This expectation shaped culture. Nomadic traditions preserved mobility. Seasonal migration reduced risk. Shared land use prevented overinvestment. Sedentary empires accumulated wealth, but also vulnerability. Ancient warnings often appear ambivalent towards cities. Cities are celebrated for culture, but criticized for arrogance. This is not moral judgment. It is structural observation. Cities concentrate resources. Concentration increases exposure. When conditions change, concentrated systems suffer disproportionately. 3I Atlas data does not predict collapse, but it highlights stress redistribution. Stress does not destroy evenly. It migrates. Ancient societies understood this through lived experience. They watched floods carve new paths. They watched fertile land turn barren. They watched populations relocate. Their stories encode this memory, not as tragedy, but as cycle. This is why ancient narratives rarely end with despair. They end with survival in altered form. Modern narratives struggle with this framing. We equate success with continuity. Ancient cultures equated success with persistence. Persistence does not require sameness. This difference shapes response. If we believe civilization must remain unchanged to survive, Any shift feels existential. If we accept transformation as normal, fear diminishes. Ancient societies cultivated this acceptance. Rituals marking endings prepared people emotionally for change. Modern societies avoid endings. We delay acknowledgement until disruption forces it. This delay increases trauma. Archaeological evidence supports this. Sudden abandonment layers often follow periods of denial. Gradual transitions correlate with preparation. Ancient warnings were tools of preparation, not predictions, but rehearsals. This is why they persist across cultures. Different regions experience different events, but encoded similar lessons. Water rises, land shifts, power fragments, life continues. Modern monitoring systems, like 3i Atlas, operate on similar principles. They track redistribution, not endpoints. They do not say, "This will end." They say, "This is changing." The difference lies in interpretation. Ancient cultures integrated interpretation into daily life. Modern societies outsource interpretation to institutions. This creates dependency. When institutions hesitate, society hesitates. Ancient societies did not wait for permission to adapt. They acted based on accumulated experience. This autonomy increased resilience. Now consider innovation after collapse. Periods following disruption often produce new technologies, social structures, and belief systems. The Iron Age followed Bronze Age collapse. Agricultural diversification followed climatic stress. Innovation thrives when constraints break. This challenges the assumption that stability is always beneficial. Too much stability stifles adaptation. Ancient warnings did not seek to preserve golden ages. They sought to prevent stagnation. This perspective reframes fear surrounding ancient prophecies. They were not warnings of doom. They were reminders that change is inevitable and survivable. The danger is not change. The danger is refusing to change. Modern civilization, optimized for efficiency, struggles with this lesson. We mistake fragility for strength. 3i Atlas does not threaten civilization. It exposes our relationship to uncertainty. Ancient warnings offer a response. Decentralize, adapt, remember. The next segment will examine how modern humans interpret ancient warnings psychologically, and why fascination with prophecy often masks deeper anxiety about control. Because what unsettles us is not the earth changing. It is the realization that we may not be in control of it. Human fascination with ancient warnings is rarely about the past. It is about control. When people turn toward prophecies, omens, or forgotten knowledge, they are not usually seeking catastrophe. They are seeking reassurance that change follows rules. If change has rules, then it can be understood. If it can be understood, then perhaps it can be managed. This psychological need runs deep. Modern humans live inside systems that feel permanent. Electric grids, global supply chains, digital networks. Yet we know, intellectually, that none of these are guaranteed. This creates tension. Ancient warnings become attractive because they offer a narrative frame where upheaval is not random, but cyclical. Cycles are comforting. They suggest that disruption is part of an order, not its absence. This is why references to forgotten prophecies resurface during periods of uncertainty. They are not signs of regression. They are signs of cognitive adaptation. People reach for stories that contextualize instability. Ancient societies did this deliberately. They used myth not to predict dates, but to normalize uncertainty. This is a subtle but important distinction. Modern interpretations often strip ancient texts of their social function. We read them literally, searching for events they might describe. Ancient audiences listened differently. They understood myth as orientation, not forecast. A myth told you how to stand in the world, not what would happen tomorrow. This orientation mattered more than accuracy. It prepared communities to act coherently under stress. Modern society often lacks this shared orientation. We possess immense data, but little narrative integration. As a result, uncertainty fragments rather than unites. Some people dismiss anomalies entirely. Others catastrophize them. Ancient societies avoided this split by embedding uncertainty into shared culture. No one was surprised by change. They expected it. This expectation reduced shock. Now consider how prophecy is misunderstood today. Prophecy is often treated as a claim about inevitability. But in ancient contexts, prophecy functioned more like conditional logic. If conditions align, expect transition. This logic is closer to modern systems thinking than mystical prediction. Ancient observers noticed correlations. Drought followed deforestation. Flooding followed land mismanagement. Social unrest followed scarcity. They encoded these correlations into narrative. When the narrative resurfaced, it reminded listeners of relationships. Modern readers often ignore this relational aspect. We focus on the dramatic elements: the flood, the fire, the sky darkening. We overlook the quieter warnings about behavior, structure, and response. This misreading fuels anxiety. People assume ancient warnings imply unavoidable disaster. In fact, many imply the opposite. They emphasize adaptation. Those who listened survived. Those who ignored patterns suffered. This framing places responsibility not on fate, but on awareness. Modern interest in systems like 3i Atlas mirrors this ancient impulse. People are not afraid of earthquakes alone. They are afraid of not knowing. Knowledge restores a sense of agency, even when it does not prevent change. This is why transparent communication matters. When information is withheld or overly simplified, anxiety grows. Ancient societies managed this by circulating stories openly. They did not restrict warnings to elites. Everyone heard them. Modern societies often gate information. This is efficient, but alienating. When people sense that patterns exist, but cannot access interpretation, distrust forms. Distrust is corrosive. It fractures collective response. Ancient warnings avoided this by decentralizing meaning. No single authority owned the story. This distributed ownership made adaptation communal rather than hierarchical. Modern societies struggle with this. We expect institutions to tell us what to think. Ancient societies expected stories to tell them how to respond. This difference shapes psychological resilience. Resilience is not about optimism. It is about coherence. Ancient narratives maintained coherence during instability. They allowed people to interpret change within a shared framework. Modern fragmentation undermines this. When interpretations diverge wildly, coordination fails. This is visible in responses to environmental stress today. Some deny change entirely. Some predict imminent collapse. Few occupy the middle ground of cautious preparedness. Ancient societies lived in that middle ground. They neither denied nor dramatized. They acknowledged uncertainty as normal. This perspective is difficult for modern minds accustomed to control, but it may be essential. The fascination with ancient prophecies is not irrational. It is a search for cognitive tools we have lost, tools that allowed societies to face instability without panic. This does not mean ancient cultures were wiser in every respect. They lacked medicine, technology, and scientific understanding. but they possessed psychological frameworks adapted to uncertainty. Modern civilization excels at prevention. It struggles with acceptance. Acceptance does not mean surrender. It means recognizing limits. Atlas does not threaten modern civilization. It reveals those limits. It reminds us that Earth systems operate beyond human schedules. Ancient warnings echoed this truth. Not as condemnation, but as context. The unsettling feeling people experience when reading these texts is not fear of catastrophe. It is fear of losing control. Control has become central to modern identity. Ancient cultures placed less emphasis on control and more on alignment. Alignment with cycles. Alignment with land. Alignment with change. This alignment reduced existential shock. Modern societies, by contrast, often experience change as betrayal. Something has gone wrong. Ancient societies expected something to change. This expectation shaped survival. In the next segment, we will move closer to the present. We will examine how modern scientific uncertainty intersects with public psychology and why bridging ancient and modern frameworks may be necessary, not to predict the future, but to respond to it wisely. Because the greatest risk is not that ancient warnings were accurate. It is that we no longer know how to listen without fear. Modern science is not uncomfortable with uncertainty. People are. This distinction matters. Scientists are trained to live inside unresolved questions. Models are provisional. Conclusions are conditional. Knowledge advances by admitting what is not yet known. Public culture, however, expects clarity. This expectation creates friction. When scientific communication becomes cautious, the public often hears avoidance. When language becomes technical, people feel excluded. When explanations are delayed, anxiety fills the gap. Ancient societies anticipated this psychological gap. They did not wait for certainty before shaping collective understanding. They accepted that explanation might never arrive, and built frameworks anyway. This is why ancient warnings feel emotionally complete, even when factually vague. They addressed meaning, not mechanism. Modern science addresses mechanism, but often avoids meaning. This imbalance contributes to unease. People do not only want to know what is happening, they want to know what it means for them. Ancient narratives answered that question directly. Modern systems rarely do. This is not a failure of science. It is a mismatch of function. Science describes reality. Narrative contextualizes it. When the two drift apart, trust erodes. This erosion is visible today. Data about environmental stress accumulates steadily. Public confidence fluctuates wildly. The problem is not lack of information, it is lack of coherence. Ancient societies maintained coherence through shared symbolic language. Everyone understood the story, even if interpretations differed. Modern societies share data, but not stories. This fragmentation produces psychological vulnerability. People either disengage or catastrophize. Neither response is adaptive. 3i Atlas exists within this tension. Its outputs are neutral, but neutrality is not emotionally neutral. Numbers without narrative feel ominous. Ancient societies solved this by embedding numbers implicitly inside meaning. They did not quantify tremors, they contextualized them. This context reduced fear, not because danger was less, but because expectation was managed. Modern humans often misinterpret calm ancient language as denial of danger. In reality, it was preparation. Calm does not mean complacent. It means oriented. This orientation is what modern society lacks. We oscillate between urgency and dismissal. Ancient cultures occupied a steady middle. This steadiness was not accidental. It was cultivated. Children grew up hearing stories of past disruptions. Adults ritualized remembrance. Leaders were reminded publicly of impermanence. This created a population psychologically prepared for transition. Modern culture emphasizes permanence. We build as if systems will last indefinitely. This assumption magnifies shock when change appears. The psychological impact of disruption is often greater than the physical one. Ancient warnings addressed psychology first. This is why they survive. They remain relevant across contexts. Now consider how modern uncertainty is framed. When scientists speak cautiously, they are often accused of hiding something. When they speak boldly, they are accused of exaggeration. This no-win scenario discourages open discourse. Ancient societies avoided this by distributing interpretation. No single voice carried absolute authority. Meaning emerged communally. Modern systems centralize authority. This increases efficiency, but reduces resilience. When central narratives falter, alternatives rush in. This is where misinformation thrives. Not because people reject science, but because they seek meaning. Ancient warnings provided meaning without certainty. Modern narratives often promise certainty without meaning. This inversion destabilizes trust. 3i, Atlas does not predict apocalypse, but it exposes a deeper issue. We have unprecedented detection capability, but limited cultural readiness. Detection without readiness amplifies anxiety. Ancient societies balanced the two. They detected patterns slowly, but prepared psychologically continuously. Modern societies detect patterns rapidly, but prepare psychologically poorly. This imbalance may be the true risk, not earthquakes, not climate shifts, but collective disorientation. History suggests that societies survive disruption when social cohesion remains intact. Cohesion requires shared understanding. Ancient warnings built that understanding over generations. Modern societies attempt to compress it into press releases. This is insufficient. The fascination with ancient prophecies is therefore not irrational. It reflects a subconscious recognition that something essential is missing. Not knowledge, but orientation. Orientation answers questions like, what should we value when systems change? What remains stable when structures fail? How do we measure success when continuity breaks? Ancient cultures answered these through myth. Modern societies have not replaced that function. This creates a vacuum. Into that vacuum flow fear, speculation, and polarization. The solution is not to resurrect prophecy. It is to recover the function prophecy served. That function was not prediction, but preparation. Preparation for uncertainty. Preparation for adaptation. Preparation for loss without collapse. 3i, Atlas. Viewed through this lens is not alarming. It is instructive. It reminds us that Earth systems are dynamic. Ancient societies accepted this as baseline. Modern civilization resists it. Resistance increases fragility. Acceptance increases resilience. This does not mean surrendering progress. It means redefining it. Progress is not permanence. It is adaptability. Ancient warnings were not backward-looking. They were forward-facing. They spoke to future listeners who would face unfamiliar conditions. That listener is us. The question is not whether not ancient civilizations foresaw our moment. They did not. The question is whether they understood something about change that we have forgotten. In the final segment, we will narrow the focus. We will step away from systems, institutions, and data, and return to the individual, because every societal transition is lived one human at a time. and understanding how individuals respond may matter more than any monitoring system ever could. There is one detail that ancient records rarely explain directly, yet they return to it again and again in subtle ways. Not as a warning, not as a prophecy, but as a condition. Across Mesopotamian texts, Egyptian myth cycles, and later fragments preserved in Greek and Near Eastern commentary, there is a recurring suggestion that the world humans inherited was not simply damaged, but altered, not destroyed, adjusted. When scribes describe the land after a great disruption, they do not dwell on fire or noise. They speak instead of silence, of absence, of spaces where something once stood, but no longer does. The earth is described as quieter, the skies as thinner. The gods, if they are mentioned at all, are distant. In Sumerian literary compositions, this transition is sometimes framed as the moment when divine activity retreats from the visible world. The Anunnaki, once described as present and administrating, begin to act through intermediaries, symbols, and decrees rather than direct presence. Scholars debate whether this reflects theological evolution or political change, but the timing is unusual. These descriptions often cluster around periods of environmental stress, abrupt climate shifts, and widespread cultural reorganization. It is here that some researchers pause. Because the texts do not describe humanity advancing into civilization as much as adjusting to a new set of constraints. Cities rise not immediately after abundance, but after instability. Agriculture intensifies not during ideal conditions, but after disruption. Administrative systems emerge not in times of ease, but in response to loss. The implication is subtle, but persistent. That civilization did not begin because conditions improved. It began because conditions changed, and humans adapted to what remained. In this context, the ancient references to boundaries become more than metaphor. In multiple myth systems, there is mention of limits placed on human movement, lifespan, or knowledge after a catastrophic event. The Sumerian king list itself notes that kingship descended from heaven only after a great reset, and even then, it arrives constrained. Earlier reigns are impossibly long. Later ones are suddenly human in scale. Some scholars interpret this as mythic exaggeration. Others suggest it reflects a memory of something lost. What matters for our question is not whether these accounts are literal, but whether they encode a perception that the world before was fundamentally different, not just socially, physically. The idea of a bounded world appears repeatedly in later philosophical traditions as well. Plato's account of Atlantis speaks not of total annihilation, but of land rendered inaccessible. Hindu cosmology describes ages ending when the world's balance is disrupted, followed by a narrowing of possibility. Even in biblical tradition, the post-flood world is one in which lifespans shorten, direct communication with the divine fades, and humanity must labor harder to survive. Different cultures, different languages, but a similar pattern: a before, a disruption, and an after that feels diminished. This brings us to an uncomfortable but academically legitimate question. What if ancient people were not describing punishment or moral failure, but adaptation to a planet that had changed its operating conditions? Modern science confirms that Earth has undergone abrupt transitions before. The Younger Dryas event, for example, represents a sudden return to glacial conditions roughly 12,900 years ago, followed by rapid warming. Its cause is still debated. Hypotheses include meltwater disruption, volcanic activity, and even cosmic impact scenarios. None are universally accepted, but what is agreed upon is speed. The change was fast enough to disrupt ecosystems, fast enough to alter human behavior, fast enough that oral memory could preserve its effects. If such an event occurred, ancient observers would not have understood it in modern scientific terms. They would have interpreted it through cosmology, through gods, through narratives of order being withdrawn. In that sense, references to a sealed world or a closed heaven may not be metaphysical at all. They may be symbolic descriptions of altered environmental access, thinner atmosphere, changed radiation exposure, unpredictable climate, conditions that require shelter, agriculture, and social coordination. In other words, civilization. Some researchers propose that myths of divine departure coincide with the moment humans are forced to become self-sustaining in a harsher environment. The gods do not leave because they are angry. They leave because conditions no longer support their presence. Or perhaps because humans can no longer perceive them in the same way. This reframing changes the tone of the ancient texts. The Anunnaki are no longer jailers or masters. They become indicators, markers of a prior state of the world. When they withdraw, the world closes, and humanity must reorganize within the boundaries that remain. This interpretation aligns with a detail often overlooked. Ancient texts rarely describe humans being created after the catastrophe. They describe humans being left to tend the land, left to remember, left to maintain order without direct oversight. In some Sumerian hymns, there is even a tone of melancholy. The gods express concern not about punishment, but about absence, about the burden now placed on humanity. Scholars debate whether this reflects political anxiety, religious evolution, or genuine cultural memory. But the pattern persists. The world after the shift is smaller, more constrained, more difficult, and more human. If we consider the possibility that ancient civilizations inherited a planet already altered by a major event, then many familiar features of early civilization take on new meaning. Why build monumental architecture so quickly? Why encode knowledge so obsessively in stone and clay? Why orient cities to the stars with such precision? Perhaps these were not expressions of newfound power, but acts of preservation. Attempts to anchor meaning in a world that no longer behaved as it once had. In that light, the idea of humanity inheriting a prepared world becomes less fantastical and more cautious. Not a prison, but a narrowed domain. A world that still functions, but within limits established by forces beyond human control. And this leads us to the most delicate point. Ancient texts rarely warn of another catastrophe. They warn of forgetting what the world was like before, forgetting the signs of change, forgetting how quickly stability can vanish. The true danger, according to these records, is not the event itself, but complacency afterward. This is why memory is sacred, why kings are listed, why floods are named, why celestial movements are tracked, why tablets are buried carefully in archives, not to predict the future, but to remind. And just before the final sections of these texts, there is often a pause, a silence, a space where the scribe stops explaining and simply records that the world continues, different, but ongoing, as if to say, this has happened before, and it may happen again. But only if we stop paying attention. That unresolved implication lingers quietly and leads us directly into the final inserted segment, where attention itself becomes the central theme. If there is one theme that quietly binds ancient warnings, modern science, and human survival, it is not catastrophe. It is attention. Ancient cultures treated attention as a resource, something that could be sharpened, dulled, or lost entirely. This is why so many early texts emphasize watching. Watching the sky, watching the water, watching the ground, watching one another. These instructions appear repeatedly, often without explanation. To the modern reader, they can feel obvious, but in ancient contexts, watching was not passive. It was active participation in reality. To watch meant to remember patterns, to notice deviations, to compare present conditions to remembered ones. In other words, to think in time. This capacity, temporal awareness, is what allowed early societies to survive repeated environmental stress. They did not know why change occurred, but they knew when something no longer behaved as expected. This is a subtle but profound difference. Modern humans are surrounded by sensors, data streams, and predictive models. Yet we often outsource attention to systems rather than cultivating it ourselves. Ancient societies did the opposite. They lacked instruments, but trained perception. Rituals, omens, and calendars were not mystical indulgences. They were attentional scaffolds. They slowed life down enough to notice change. In this context, ancient warnings were not alarms. They were reminders to stay awake to reality. Now consider how this contrasts with modern life. We live inside constant stimulation. Information arrives faster than reflection can process it. Attention fragments. When change occurs gradually, it disappears into noise. This is why slow threats feel invisible. Ancient societies had fewer distractions. Change stood out. This difference may explain why ancient people notice shifts that modern humans overlook. Not because they were wiser, but because they were less distracted. This is not romanticism. It is cognitive science. Studies show that attention determines what we perceive, not sensory input alone. Two people can observe the same environment and notice entirely different things. Ancient cultures trained collective attention toward environmental cues. Modern cultures train attention toward abstract systems. Neither is inherently superior, but each has blind spots. Atlas represents an attempt to compensate for modern blind spots. It watches what humans no longer reliably can, but it cannot create meaning. It can only signal. Meaning must still be constructed by people. Ancient societies integrated signaling and meaning. When the ground trembled, it was not just a physical event. It was a prompt for discussion, ritual, and social adjustment. This integration reduced shock. Modern societies separate signal from response. Signals go to experts. Responses come later, if at all. This delay creates vulnerability. Ancient warnings aimed to shorten this gap. They did not wait for certainty. They trained responsiveness. Responsiveness is different from reaction. Reaction is immediate and emotional. Responsiveness is deliberate and adaptive. Ancient societies prized the latter. This is why their warnings feel calm. Calm does not indicate ignorance. It indicates preparation. Now we return to the idea of inherited worlds. If humanity inherited a planet already altered by a major event, then early civilizations would have developed under conditions of constrained possibility. This constraint would shape attention. They would notice limits. Limits on land fertility. Limits on weather predictability. Limits on human lifespan. These limits would become normalized. Modern humans, living in a brief period of relative stability, often mistake normality for permanence. This is dangerous. Ancient warnings were designed to counter this illusion. They reminded people that stability is conditional, that the earth does not promise continuity, that adaptation is not optional. This message remains relevant, not because ancient prophecies were accurate, but because the psychology behind them was adaptive. Modern interest in ancient warnings often misfires because it focuses on outcomes rather than posture. People ask, will this happen again? Ancient texts implicitly ask, will you notice when it does? This reframing shifts responsibility. It places agency back in human awareness. 3i, Atlas, again, does not demand belief. It demands interpretation. Interpretation requires attention. Attention requires slowing down. Ancient cultures built slowness into life. Modern societies resist it. This resistance may be our greatest vulnerability. Not because disasters are coming, but because we may fail to recognize transition until options narrow. Ancient societies often survived by moving early. Migration appears repeatedly in archaeological records. Movement before crisis preserved life. Movement after crisis meant desperation. Ancient warnings encouraged early movement. Social, economic, psychological, they trained people to accept relocation, role change, and loss of status. Modern society resists all three. We cling to place, identity, and hierarchy. This rigidity increases suffering during transition. Ancient warnings attempted to soften this attachment. They reminded people that roles are temporary, that cities fall, that continuity resides in relationships, not structures. This lesson is uncomfortable for modern readers. It undermines assumptions about progress, but it is historically grounded. Civilizations that adapted to change survived longer than those that denied it. This is not moral judgment, it is observation. Now consider the role of memory. Ancient societies treated memory as survival technology. Forgetting was dangerous. This is why genealogies, king lists, and disaster narratives were preserved meticulously. They were not nostalgia. They were warning systems. Modern societies externalize memory to databases. This is efficient but fragile. If systems fail, memory vanishes. Ancient societies distributed memory across people. This redundancy preserved knowledge. This difference matters in moments of transition. When systems fail, distributed memory endures. This brings us to the quietest, most unsettling implication. Perhaps the most important ancient warning was not about Earth changing, but about humans forgetting how to pay attention. Forgetting how to notice gradual change, forgetting how to live without guarantees, forgetting how to adapt without panic. If that is true, then the relevance of ancient warnings is not about prediction. It is about recovery. Recovering attentional skills, recovering patience, recovering humility. The Atlas may detect patterns beyond human perception, but it cannot teach humans how to respond. Ancient cultures tried. Their success was uneven, but their intent was clear. They left reminders, not instructions. They assumed future listeners would face different conditions. They trusted those listeners to adapt if they remembered the posture. Now, as we approach the final ending of this story, one thought remains. If humanity did inherit a changed world, then perhaps the true inheritance was not land or technology. It was responsibility. Responsibility to notice. Responsibility to remember. Responsibility to adapt without losing coherence. Whether we meet that responsibility today is still an open question, and that question lingers quietly, waiting to be noticed. Every great transition in history is experienced twice. First, as a collective shift, measured in climate records, settlement layers, and changing trade routes. And then, more quietly, as a personal reckoning. Ancient civilizations understood this. Their warnings were never addressed to humanity as an abstract whole. They were addressed to listeners, individuals sitting by firelight, families preparing for seasonal change, communities deciding whether to stay or move. The scale of transformation was vast, but the experience was intimate. This is often forgotten when we talk about collapse or transition. We imagine cities falling. We imagine empires ending. But what actually happens is far more subtle. A farmer notices the soil no longer behaves as it once did. A fisher realizes the waters have shifted. A traveler finds familiar paths unreliable. Change announces itself softly. Ancient narratives focused on this softness. They rarely described the moment of rupture. They described the moment of recognition. That moment, when something feels off, but not yet catastrophic, is where adaptation begins. Modern civilization tends to overlook this phase. We define danger by thresholds, temperature limits, seismic magnitudes, statistical significance. Ancient societies defined danger by felt continuity. When continuity weakened, they paid attention. This difference matters, because systems do not fail when metrics cross lines. They fail when human behavior fails to adjust. 3i Atlas for all, its complexity, ultimately returns us to this truth. It does not tell us what will happen. It shows us that something is changing. And change, historically, has always required response at the human level. Not policy alone, not technology alone, but perception. Ancient warnings trained perception. They taught people to notice gradual shifts without panic. This training created psychological resilience. Modern humans are rarely trained this way. We are taught to expect stability, to trust continuity, to believe disruption is anomaly rather than pattern. When disruption appears, it feels existential. Ancient cultures did not feel this shock as strongly. They expected endings. They ritualized them. This did not eliminate suffering, but it reduced paralysis. Paralysis is what destroys societies. Not earthquakes, not floods, but inability to act coherently. Ancient warnings addressed this risk. They did not attempt to stop change. They attempted to preserve agency. Agency is the capacity to choose response. Modern society has immense power, but fragile agency. We rely on systems to act for us. When systems hesitate, individuals feel helpless. Ancient societies cultivated agency locally. Communities made decisions together. Knowledge was shared, not specialized. This increased redundancy. Redundancy is inefficient, but resilient. Modern civilization optimizes efficiency. Efficiency reduces redundancy. This makes systems brittle. 3i Atlas highlights this brittleness, not by design but by implication. It reveals interconnected stress. Interconnection amplifies both strength and weakness. Ancient societies lived with less interconnection, but more independence. This trade-off shaped outcomes. Now we arrive at the most unsettling realization. Ancient warnings were not about what would happen. They were about how people respond when it does. This shifts the meaning entirely. The question is not whether a terrestrial shift is approaching. The question is whether we have retained the psychological tools to face one. Ancient civilizations did not know the future, but they knew themselves. They knew that denial delayed adaptation. They knew that rigidity increased suffering. They knew that arrogance blinded leaders. They encoded these lessons in stories that survived long after buildings fell. Those stories reach us now, not as commands, but as invitations. An invitation to rethink what stability means, to reconsider the assumption that progress is linear, to remember that survival has always favored flexibility over permanence. Modern technology offers unprecedented insight into Earth systems, But insight alone is not enough. Without cultural frameworks that accept change, insight becomes anxiety. Ancient cultures balanced fear with meaning. They did not promise safety. They promised continuity of values. That promise mattered. It allowed people to move without losing identity. It allowed cultures to fragment without disappearing. It allowed humanity to persist through repeated transformations. This persistence is the true legacy of ancient warnings. Not prediction, but endurance. As we sit here now, surrounded by digital certainty and existential unease, it is worth asking what we have lost. Not knowledge, orientation. Orientation is knowing how to stand when the ground shifts. Ancient societies trained this skill. Modern societies rarely do. This does not mean we should abandon science or embrace myth. It means we should recognize that science describes change, but does not teach acceptance. Ancient warnings taught acceptance. Acceptance does not mean resignation. It means readiness. Readiness to adapt rather than cling. Readiness to decentralize rather than control. Readiness to remember what matters when structures fall away. Perhaps this is why ancient warnings still resonate. Not because they foresaw our technologies or our systems, but because they understood something timeless, that the earth changes, that societies change, that humans endure when they remember how to change with them. And perhaps the quietest truth is this: the most important shift is never geological. It is psychological. The moment we stop asking how to preserve the world exactly as it is, and start asking how to live meaningfully as it becomes something else, that is when resilience begins. Ancient civilizations left us no map of the future. They left us something more useful: a posture, a way of facing uncertainty without fear. Whether we choose to recover that posture or continue insisting on permanence is not a question any system can answer for us. It is one each generation answers quietly, one decision at a time.